Today, we're diving into one of the most terrifying events in all of human history. But this isn't just a story about a disease. It's really about how a tiny little bacterium completely shattered the medieval world, and from all that chaos, accidentally forged a revolution. Let's get into it.
If you want to understand the sheer terror of this moment, you've got to start with the words of the people who actually lived through it. 𝗕𝗹𝗰𝗸𝗁, he was writing from Florence, and he just captures the horror perfectly. It wasn't just that it was deadly, it was how it spread. It was like fire. Imagine a world where just being near someone could be an instant death sentence. That was their reality. And the scale of that reality, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. In just a couple of years, the Black Death killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire population of Europe. Think about that. That's not a tragedy. It's an apocalypse. An event so devastating it would literally change the course of history forever.
So where did this nightmare even come from? In this first section, we're going to track the plague's origin and its unstoppable march across a continent that had absolutely no idea what was about to hit it. The speed of its spread was just breathtaking. It started out on the Asian steppes, carried by rats and fleas on merchant ships. In 1347, it hits this Genoese trading post called 𝗕𝗲. From there, ships trying to flee just carry it right into the heart of Europe. In less than 3 years, it had swallowed nearly the entire continent. For people back then, it must have felt like the end of the world was unfolding in real time. And in the face of this kind of horror, society just fractured. The way people tried to explain the plague depended completely on where you stood in the social order. For the vast majority, the peasantry, this was biblical. Straight up, this was God's wrath, a punishment for sin. But the educated elite, they tried to find a more, scientific cause. The medical faculty at the University of Paris actually blamed it on a planetary alignment from 1345 that they said corrupted the air. You had two completely different worlds experiencing the exact same catastrophe. And that leads us to our next section. Because when prayers didn't work and the church couldn't offer any real protection, one of the main pillars of medieval life, faith, it just started to crumble. This created a huge power vacuum, and what rushed in to fill that void was, it was both radical and deeply corrupt. So the thinking went something like this. If the church can't save you, maybe you have to save yourself. And that was the idea behind the Flagellants. This was a radical, grassroots religious movement. They believed the clergy had totally failed, and that only extreme, personal, and very public suffering could possibly convince God to call off the plague. And when I say extreme, I mean it was brutal. The Friar Heinrich of Herford described their rituals in gruesome detail. They'd march from town to town, whipping themselves with these metal-tipped scourges. It was this shocking spectacle of pure devotion and desperation, a sign of a society that felt totally abandoned by its spiritual leaders. But the crisis of faith wasn't just about movements like the Flagellants. The institutional church, it was decaying from the inside out. The plague had killed off so many experienced and educated clergy, and that left a void that was filled by the unqualified and, frankly, the opportunistic. This led to a huge rise in something called simony. It's basically the practice of buying your way into a church office. All of a sudden, positions that were once held by devout, trained men were just being sold off to the highest bidder. You can imagine peasants are looking to their local priest for guidance, and instead they're seeing corrupt, often illiterate guys who cared way more about money than salvation. And this corruption, it did not go unnoticed. A theologian named John Wycliffe saw this sickness in the church, and he even used the language of disease to describe it. He called simony a leprosy, a contagion that was rotting the church from within. And his powerful critiques, they would plant the seeds for a rebellion that went way beyond just religion. Okay, so this brings us to what might be the most revolutionary consequence of the plague. As that old spiritual world was collapsing, a whole new economic world was being born. Mass death had this surprising, unintended side effect. For the very first time, the common laborer had power. The logic is really simple, but it was completely transformative. The whole feudal system was built on having way too much cheap labor, and then bam, half the workforce is gone. Landowners who used to have peasants begging for work were now the ones who were desperate. They had to compete for laborers, which meant wages just skyrocketed. Peasants could suddenly leave their manor for better pay, eat better food, wear better clothes. Their world had been turned upside down, but for the survivors, it was actually in a good way. Of course, you can probably guess the aristocracy was not about to just let this happen. This new peasant power threatened the very foundation of their wealth, their social order, everything. Their entire world was built on keeping the lower classes down, so they responded not by adopting, but by using the full force of the law to try and turn back the clock. And they were very specific about it. In 1349, they passed the Ordinance of Laborers, which basically froze wages at pre-plague levels. When that didn't work, they doubled down with the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This didn't just fix wages, it also made it illegal for peasants to leave their lord's land. They had just gotten a taste of freedom and prosperity, and now the ruling class was trying to violently snatch it away. And this is where our story reaches its climax. You've got a population that's lost faith in its spiritual leaders, and now it's being economically crushed by its political leaders. This incredibly volatile combination was just about to explode. At the exact same time, these radical new ideas were spreading, captured in popular poems like 𝗕𝗄𝗃 Plowman. And the message was revolutionary. It was that the plague had been the great equalizer. In the mass graves, in the charnel houses, you couldn't tell a noble from a peasant. Their skeletons were identical. So the question became, if everyone is equal in death, why aren't they equal in life? And in the summer of 1381, English peasants, just fueled by decades of frustration, decided to make that idea a reality. This wasn't just some riot over a new tax. This was a full-blown uprising aimed at tearing down the entire feudal structure.
Just look at their demands to the king. They weren't asking for reform. They were demanding a revolution. They wanted an end to serfdom, period. The abolition of the aristocracy's power, the seizure of the church's enormous wealth, and that final demand just says it all. Let there be no more villains, but all to be free and of one condition. They were demanding a world of total, radical equality. In the end, the Peasants' Revolt was crushed, but the world it was fighting against was already dying. You see, the Black Death didn't create the problems in medieval society, the corruption, the inequality, but it exposed them so brutally that they just couldn't be ignored anymore. And it's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that massive crises don't just break things, they reveal what was already broken all along, forcing a reckoning that can change absolutely everything.